Hi there, Victor Pross speaking to you, anarchist artist. Okay, today I'm going to be reviewing an article by the Jolly Libertarian. The Jolly Libertarian. Um, I know this individual myself. He lives here in Vancouver with me. I've met him once, but I've had considerable engagement with him online. And I've even had a debate with him on a program as well. So I'm familiar with the individual whose article I'm about to read for the first time and review. It just caught my attention, and I thought that I would share my reading of this article, which you'll find interesting in and of itself. And I hope you will find my commentary in regards to it also interesting. Basically, what caught my attention was that this individual, in prefacing his article when he posted it on Facebook, and you can go look at the full article there if you want to on Facebook. His own page is called The Jolly Libertarian, and the article is called What I Believe. And the first paragraph kind of caught my attention for me to want to continue to read through it. And here it is, what he said. They say you can't teach an old dog new tricks, or that a leopard can't change its spots. Such expressions are meant to imply that people become set in their ways, that they can't change, that ideas, once implanted in our brains, becomes fixed. This is true of some people, but I believe that this implies a rigid mindset, a mind impervious to new ideas, new evidence, and new understanding. The mindset I'm describing may be called doctrinaire. I've been an independent thinker for a long time, and the first notable instance being when I rejected confirmation into my family's church at age 13. Although my confirmation classmates were all confirmed, I was the lone holdout. I had enough doubts that I could not, in good conscience, stand up in front of the congregation and make a lot of oaths that I did not believe. In 1969, I discovered the works of Ayn Rand and soon joined an objectivist study group. While everyone in our group was in fundamental agreement with Rand's ideas, we rejected the personality cult that surrounded Rand, calling the true believers Randroids. We largely believed Nathaniel Branden's response to his excommunication from Rand's inner circle. This did not diminish our enthusiasm for Rand's ideas. Unquote. Now, this is this is what caught my attention, and I know that this individual is a libertarian who, as you can see, is quite familiar with Ayn Rand, but converted, as it were, over to libertarianism from, I guess, his original objectivist stance, and became a libertarian. And but now libertarianism, you see, is something that's under critical review. I'm changing my mind about that now, and that's kind of like the gist of this article. And the reason why I find it interesting is because most certainly this rigid mindset that this individual, the Jolly Libertarian, insinuates is, I don't think, a characteristic of a lot of libertarians. It certainly is not it certainly is not characteristic of me, for Christ's sakes. My open-mindedness is evidenced by the fact that I was somebody who at one time, for example, believed in God. I'm an atheist, and at one point in time when I believed in the Randian conception of government, and previous to that, I just generally believed in government and the welfare state and etc. It was very young, but the point is that I underwent a evolution and an intellectual overhaul of my ideas 3 to 4 times now, I guess you could say, right? Some things are set, that's for sure. Like if somebody says, no, you're just not open-minded, and I might go, well, killing infants, just taking anybody's infant and burying them and having fun setting on fire, Yeah. Are you rigid? That's a bad thing. Yeah, I'm pretty set. That's a bad thing. I'm a rigid. I'm an absolutist, right? But there's other areas, of course, of where, you know, there is room for improvement, change, or whatnot. Yeah, there is. It is a good thing if you do change your mind. It is indicative of intellectual growth. That's all well and fine, right? I don't think that I'm going to be just as charitable in the review of this article and this man's intellectual evolution, but we will see why that is the case as we move along, won't we? Okay, now now he's talking about himself as a young man. I guess he's in his 60s right now. Now this soon led my interest in the libertarian movement, which I have loosely followed ever since. From 1972 to 1978, after I had moved to Vancouver, I did not know any other libertarians nor sought them out. But I read a fair amount, both books and magazines like Reason. And in 1978, two Torontonians moved to Vancouver and set up the Libertarian Foundation. I heard about them on the radio and not long after moved in with them and some others who were keen on promoting libertarians in Vancouver. A friend and I set up the first Libertarian Party Writing Association here. I wrote and edited various newsletters. I flirted with the anarchist wing of the libertarian movement at that time. With the collapse of the price of gold in 1981, I started becoming skeptical of elements within the libertarian movement. The gold bug faction in this case. But I was still a dyed-in-the-wool libertarian, believing in its basic tenets. I helped organize the 1996 Society for Individual Liberty Conference at Whistler, BC, where I got to meet a number of notables in the movement. By 2000, however, I dropped out completely from active participation in the movement. I had encountered libertarians who were active Holocaust deniers and even entered a lengthy online debate with one. The movement seemed to attract people on the fringe of society. And as a married man with children, I was very much a part of the mainstream society. While critical of aspects of society, I could not muster up the sort of righteous indignation so many in the movement seemed to feel. So my libertarianism became a quiet personal thing like it had since the 1970s. It was largely philosophical and never really activist. I was not out to change society. After I retired, I started this blog. The blog that he refers to, of course, is his blog called the Jolly Libertarian, which I came across on Facebook. I started this blog with the aim of promoting libertarianism, but also of being a self-critical voice within libertarianism. 2 years ago, I went back to university and have since taken several courses in political philosophy. My reading since retirement took me outside of mainstream libertarianism, and my beliefs have been in flux ever since. They are now starting to ferment in a definite direction, largely as a result of my introduction to one political philosopher in particular. Janet, I think I'm going to mispronounce this name. I'm going to butcher it. So, Janet Azatat. See, I just butchered it. AzazenStat. I only heard of her last year through a libertarian friend. I have used her writings as source material for my essays for my political science classes thus last summer. So here is where my thinking has now evolved to. Oh, let's see what we get. Now, he has a section here called Metaphysics and Epistemology of where his ideas have changed. But I don't want this to be like too involved a reading for this article and for this podcast that I'm doing right now. I don't want to go off into some girth of Atlas Shrugged, 500,000 pages, Molyneux, 4 hours later kind of podcast. So what I want to do is just move over to ethics and politics of where this intellectual overhaul is taking place in this 50 years being a libertarian, quasi semi-libertarian, I guess, not quite settled with it all, I guess. And we're going to find out, what the problems are, as far as this individual, the Jolly Libertarian, sees it when it comes to libertarianism. Mind you, saying that, though, doesn't mean that I don't have my own criticisms, but I'm going to be critiquing this individual's criticisms, which are not quite mine, or otherwise I would be in agreement with them. Ethics. This section begins. For a long time, I subscribed to Ayn Rand's ethics of rational egoism. To some extent, I still do. But her philosophy de-emphasized the importance of benevolence, even though she always talked about a benevolent view of life. I have yet to read David Kelly's Unrugged Individualism, The Selfish Basis of Benevolence, which is on my reading list. But I believe benevolence goes beyond selfishness. I believe benevolence goes beyond selfishness. Well, it doesn't, not if you understand Rand's entire communication and conception in elaborating details on what that means to be selfish, or if that's too crass a word in too many people's lexicon, rational selfishness. But I believe benevolence goes beyond selfishness, he writes. Now, selfishness, or rational egoism, as it were, does not necessarily exclude, or I don't even have to say not even necessarily, does not exclude benevolence. Benevolence. Have you ever find that those people who are happy with their life, who are happy individuals, who've achieved their selfish purposes in life because they do not sacrifice themselves. They're not a doormat. They're not Mother Teresa, where they think that the measurement of the good means how much you lose and somebody else benefits, and not even has to objectively, rationally benefit as due to your actions. All you have to know is that you acted not for your purpose, but for somebody else's. Like even for even for those people. Yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. For those people who are happy, are benevolently, more inclined to be benevolently disposed to others. People who are happy with their lives, who live by reason, who live by rational self-interest, can and do, notwithstanding, accidents or misfortunes or the disappointing behavior of other people, for those people who do achieve a state of happiness, are benevolently more inclined to be benevolently disposed to other people. So I really don't know what this means. I believe benevolence goes beyond selfishness. Jonathan Haidt, I'm probably mispronouncing that name too. I'm continuing the article though. Jonathan Haidt, in his research in moral psychology, discovered that empathy is very common and natural to most people. But he notes that research has shown that libertarians are notably lacking in empathy, everything becoming intellectualized. Empathy is, for many libertarians, unnatural. I have to call bullshit right out from the gate here, I really do. If this is supposed to be like, this could be a criticism of certain libertarianism. But there's no doctrine or tenet or ideas that are within libertarianism, and in all of its history and all of its writings from its intellectual spokespeople, there's nothing whatsoever in the libertarian philosophy that speaks down, excludes, bypasses, marginalizes benevolence. Quite the opposite. Quite the opposite. It is the belief ultimately in the individual and that society as a whole, if it is a progressive and industrial society that does recognize individual rights, etc., if that were an actual stateless society, there's a lot of people who are benevolently disposed to the misfortunes of others. All you have to do, once again, is just look at, for example, what the charity stats are, the type of money that these institutions take in, and people who are giving until it hurts, even after they've been taxed up the ass, are still give and help. Sometimes not wisely. Sometimes they're just a benevolence of parasitism. But for the most part, though, this idea of this crusty old libertarian, might be characteristic of some individuals, but that's an individual problem. That speaks to that person. It does not speak to libertarianism. But this broad sweep that this guy has taken, the Jolly Libertarian, is kind of cast a shadow of doubt on libertarianism as such, and not any specific individual who might have a miser attitude towards life. I have a lot of natural empathy. Well, like you, for example, Mr. Jolly Libertarian, you're a jolly libertarian. You're a libertarian. You have a lot of natural empathy. Do you have some kind of monopolized reserve on that, or a greater share of the empathy pie over other libertarians? Okay. Certainly not in my case. Okay. I'm a very giving person, for Christ's sakes. I take homeless people to lunch. I just don't throw them a couple of coins. I take them to lunch. And I'm an anarchist, which is even more absolutist, I guess, than libertarianism. But anyway, let's not make this anecdotal. I am easily moved to tears over tragic circumstances, particularly as they involve individuals. I'm not as easily moved in the abstract. A story about flooding or hurricanes or tornadoes devastating an area do not affect me a great deal, but specific and personal accounts of tragedy do. This came out more than I realized when I did volunteer work coaching recovering drug addicts and alcoholics in remedial English and computer skills. I never had a lot of use for drunks and drug addicts, but meeting these men face to face, hearing their stories, moved me greatly. We do not know the backstories of people. Someone once posted the following, which struck a chord with me. The topic was bullying. Okay, I don't have to. I'll just bypass that. We get the idea. I don't have to give another concrete example of what a caring, open-hearted, crying individual this is. Now, I believe empathy and concern for others is of much greater importance than is often acknowledged in the libertarian movement. This is especially so in the realm of politics, where people who want to put their natural empathy for others into concrete action are routinely condemned as totalitarian control freaks, instead of trying to understand the sense of common humanity that often motivates such views. I believe, let me take a second stab at that sentence. I believe empathy and concern for others is of much greater importance than is often acknowledged in the libertarian movement. I don't necessarily agree with that, but let's continue anyway. This is especially so in the realm of politics, where people who want to put their natural empathy for others into concrete action are routinely condemned as totalitarian control freaks, instead of trying to understand the sense of common humanity that often motivates such views. Well, what are you talking about here in the Mr. Jolly Libertarian? Like, are you talking about the welfare state? Is that an example of benevolence? If it's so, then that just calls for an entirely separate video to dissect and examine the welfare state. Like, what are you speaking to? I believe empathy and concern for others is of much greater importance than other libertarians acknowledge. This is especially so in the realm of politics, where people want to put their natural empathy for others into concrete action. Like what? In the realm of politics, to put what empathetic promptings or turnings or inclinations into political action that libertarians are condemning as totalitarian, etc. Like, what would be the example? Let's see if we get an example. Is he speaking of the welfare state? That's supposed to be the welfare state. It's supposed to be like a beacon of state benevolence or something like that. But like, so what is it? What is it? Let's see if we get it. Let's see if he delivers. Canadian political economist Stephen Leacock, best known for his humorous fiction writing, wrote in The Unresolved Riddle of Social Justice that the nation which neglects the aged and infirm, which leaves a family to be shipwrecked as a result of a single accident to a breadwinner, cannot survive as against a nation in which the welfare of each is regarded as contributory to the safety of all. Even the purest selfishness would dictate a policy of social insurance. Well, he dances around the edges of it, but he doesn't really speak as to this example of state benevolence in action that libertarians are opposing by deed or word. So, what is it? Policy of social insurance. Social insurance, what does that mean? Are you talking about the welfare state? If you are, why don't you just fucking say it? Which brings us to the Jolly Libertarian continues. Politics. The Jolly Libertarian. Okay. There's all ways to express your benevolence. It doesn't have to be through state action. There is such a thing as private charity. You know that, right? Private charity. Have you heard of it? Libertarian political theory is very basic and very simple. No person or group has the right to initiate, and is italicized initiate, the use of force against another. The only proper use of force is in self-defense or in retaliation against those who have initiated it. What could be simpler? The Jolly Libertarian asks, rhetorically. What could be more elegant? To libertarians, the logic is so strong that any deviance from the so-called non-aggression principle is routinely condemned as evil. I used to subscribe to this view, but my recent readings and studies have changed my mind on a number of issues. So now the non-aggression principle is in question here. I've spoken myself to libertarians who have questioned the non-aggression principle, but only on the basis of that it's not enough. It's a good foundation, it's a good starting point, but hardly exhausts, the study of ethics, for Christ's sakes. It's all well and good for certain individuals to critique libertarianism or the non-aggression principle by stating, well, the non-aggression principle is all well and good, but it's incomplete. It doesn't can complete the whole story of what ethics is all about and what it has to offer and what that study is all about. Simply refraining from hurting other people and not engaging in acts of murder, rape, theft. By not doing that, doesn't really leave open the question of what I should do. It just tells me what I shouldn't do, but in the study of general philosophy, which has been tackled by philosophers for eons, as what is the good? What is the good person? Picks up from non-aggression. So what should this individual do now that we know what he shouldn't do, right? So, but this individual, the Jolly Libertarian, though, is questioning the non-aggression principle as such. You understand, as such, which is quite distinct from the type of person that I just indicated, and I can agree with that. Of course, the non-aggression principle hardly exhausts the panorama of the study of ethics as a science. Of course not, right? There's the issue of of being a self-sustaining person, being productive, etc. That's more of an injunction following along the lines of what an individual should do, as opposed to what he shouldn't do. Okay. Okay. The logic is so strong that any deviance from the so-called non-aggression principle is routinely condemned as evil. I used to subscribe to this view, but my recent readings of the most important of these mind changes is a better understanding of John Locke. Locke is famous for his second treatise of government. For libertarians, there are two primary elements to consider. One is the defense of property rights using state of nature theory. The other is that legitimate government comes through the consent of the governed. The latter is more important and the one least elaborated on by libertarians. One is the defense of property one is the defense of property rights using the state of nature theory. The other is the legitimate government comes through the consent of the governed. This latter is more important and the one least elaborated on by libertarians. That's such bullshit. It's such bullshit, for Christ's sakes. This whole thing of the social contract or the consent of the government, the consent of the governed, rather, excuse me, has been thoroughly refuted by libertarians and therefore combed over quite thoroughly, quite well. So what is he talking about? The latter is more important and the one least elaborated on by libertarians. Okay, whatever. Yeah, no libertarians don't talk about consent theory. Don't talk about the social contract. No. There's no critiques that can be found among libertarians on that, right? What? Libertarian thought, starting with Lysander Spooner and continuing up through Murray Rothbard and even Robert Nozick, all rejected the idea that modern Western democracies actually have the consent of the governed. Yeah, that's right. Accurately so. They have adopted the Spooner view that if you didn't sign it, it ain't binding. Let's see what his criticism on this is. Locke resolved the problem with the idea of tacit consent. The issue troubled even some of the founders of the United States. James Madison recognized the impossibility of getting everyone to give explicit consent and its anarchist implications when he wrote, "I find no relief from such embarrassments but in the received doctrine that a tacit consent may be given to establish governments and law, and that this assent is to be inferred from the omission of the express revocation." I'm mispronouncing that word. It is doubtful whether it be possible to exclude wholly the idea of an implied or tacit consent without subverting the very foundation of civil society. Okay, first of all, this whole idea of tacit consent of the governed, You know, any given society that's under the rule of a government goes through various migrations and changes and things like that. How is this consent continuously given generation after generation after generation? Tacit or otherwise? Like, is the government a perpetual checking in with the population that it rules over to see if we still got your consent? You know, like where is this magical, mystical consent coming from? You know, like based on what empirical evidence do you find consent among a population being ruled by government, even a totalitarian government? You know, where because there's no rioting in the streets or anything like that, the people are all hush hush and keeping to themselves. We're talking about a totalitarian government. So therefore, they gave their consent to the totalitarian government because there's been no objections. So therefore, consent is tacit. Yeah, baby. Idiotic. Of course, critiques of consent theory and the social contract and whatnot. I don't have to go into any lengthy diatribe of refutation here. It's so thoroughly documented and well-trenched. You can find that, you know, among many other libertarians if you're not already familiar with it, but you can find that elsewhere. I have to keep this brief. I want to chop this down as much as I can, of course, right, without going on and on. Libertarians on the anarchist side of things, to continue with Mr. Jolly Libertarian's article here, libertarians on the anarchist side of things, and who are, in my opinion, the dominant faction in the movement, reject this out of hand. Robert Nozick notably wrote, "Tacit consent is not worth the paper it is not written on." But is this a valid take on tacit consent? The Jolly Libertarian asks. Let's see what he has to say. Let's see what the Jolly Libertarian has to say in regards to this. Let's take a look at oh, yeah, I got a few viewers here. Oh, that's good. Let's go back to the article. Okay. Tacit consent is everywhere and takes place in a wide variety of contexts. If a man kisses a woman and she doesn't pull away or say no, but reciprocates, consent is assumed. It's tacit consent. If a customer buys a product and it turns out to have a defect, say there's a hair in your hamburger, the customer returns the product and demands a new one. There is a tacit understanding that the product delivered was to meet certain standards, and its failure to do so necessitated rectifying the defect. Sure, the vendor could say, "Sorry, buddy, you ain't getting your money back." But he could lose his reputation and his customers in short order if he persistently did this. Tacit consent to live under the rules established by the government under whose jurisdiction you live is similar. Oh my. Oh, that's just painful. Talk about a conflation, for Christ's sakes. It's just like, so he sets it up as the example, as we see here, is just that, you know, you're on a romantic date with a woman. Could be the first date, could be the fifth date. Who knows, right? We don't know. But you're on a date. You feel that things are going good. Yeah, you move in for that big first kiss. She doesn't recoil or push you away. Maybe she even moves forward to you, right? She hasn't said, "I now officially, in the name of the non-aggression principle, hereby give my consent." But first of all, sign here that we have this agreement, right? So it's not tacit, it's explicit, you know. So he conflates that with government. That's a big hauling fucking leap, I've got to tell you, right? But just how is this consent given? Just how is this consent given beyond Jolly Libertarian's assertion that such is the case? Tacit consent to live under the rules established by the government, under whose jurisdiction you live, is similar. Oh man, like yeah, going back to the to that totalitarian government, right? Like if you don't push away or turn your head because you don't want to be kissed by this government, then you're giving your consent, you see? So Madison is right, the Jolly Libertarian declares, and Nozick is wrong. Based on what? Because you just said so? The flaw lies in the assumption that because there is no explicit consent, there is no consent at all. It presumes to make a case for each and every citizen in a jurisdiction. But the fact is, while some libertarian anarchists may not give consent, tacit or otherwise, a great many, indeed the majority of citizens, do give their consent. Really? Really? Okay. As evidenced by what? As evidenced by, okay, even take the individual who would say, and I'm sure you've come across that type of person who said, you know what? I believe in government. Yes, that's right. That's right. I believe in government. That's right. I gladly give my taxes for the maintenance and the functioning of government. You know, I consent. I am for government. And taxes is nothing more than the price of civilization. And it's the payment for those people who are duly elected so they can maintain this institution called government. That's what taxes are for. I'm for taxes. I am for government. I give my consent. So that's to say that the involuntary nature of the initiation of force that it characterizes, that is the very hub, the very definition, the very core, the very nature of government is a coercive institution that all of a sudden evaporates because these handful of people, or a great majority of people, believe in government. All of a sudden, the nature of government as an institution of initiatory force has evaporated. And how and why is it now a consent government as opposed to a institution that initiates force? Well, let's say that you change your mind. Let's say that you go through another intellectual hall and you say, I decide that, well, no, I'm changing my mind. I don't want to give my taxes anymore for whatever reasons, because it is initiatory. I did not agree to this. I do not agree to which the taxes are being put to use. I changed my mind. Well, good for you. Good for you. What the fuck? What are you going to change your mind? How are you going to act on that? What are you going to do now? You'll find out just exactly where your fucking consent goes if you change your mind and you decide to withhold payment of taxes for government services because you've changed your mind. You've gone through a further intellectual overhaul. Now, do you just go along your merry way now? No repercussions, no consequences from that institution? Is your consent still there? And since we're using this example of the man and a woman on a date moving in for the kiss, let's use that. Let's say that that she doesn't consent, right? Let's say he moves in for that kiss. She doesn't really want it, but she's a wilting flower, obsequious person, weak-willed, whatever. She turns her head, but he moves in. He becomes a little bit more aggressive. All of a sudden, he's pushing her down. He takes out a knife. Let's just go really dramatic here. Takes out a knife, and he starts ripping at her clothes and things like that. And she's crying, but she's compliant. She's not fighting back. She's not screaming. She's not yelling. She's not punching. She's not doing any of that. Maybe she's frozen with terror. Who knows, right? And she's just saying, just, just don't hurt me. Like, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? Take off your clothes. I'll take off my clothes. I'll remove, she's complying. Like, is this consent? Is this consent because she's not fighting, because she's not objecting? No objection here. But he has a knife to her throat, mind you. Has a knife to her throat. But she has not explicitly said, do not do this. Is it still rape? Is the consent intact? And at the same time, too, we have to remember here what Mr. Jolly Libertarian is forgetting here is that what separates the government from any other institution in society? What distinguishes a government that makes it a government by definition, that separates it from any other institution? It's the involuntarianism of it. It's the initiation of force. That is one of the core characteristics that makes up this definition of government. And I've covered this in other podcasts, in defining government and whatnot. This whole idea of John Locke's consent theory and whatnot speaks to a certain theory of government, speaks to a certain kind of government. But there's all kinds of governments. There's oligarchies. There's monarchies. There's communist governments. There's the Nazi government. All types of governments. All types of governments. Are those consent governments? No. What strings all these governments together under a common banner that makes up the definition is the initiation of force. Compliance, obedience, and because I said so is the core of government. Now, objectivists like to come up with this whole thing of like the government's role is the protection of the individual, but that's not a definition of government. That's nothing more than the indication of, according to Rand's philosophy, of what a government ought to do, but it does not speak to government as such, okay, to that institution in all of its manifestations, communist, totalitarian, oligarchies, Nazi, oligarchies, any other type of sundry totalitarian governments. What strings all governments together is the initiation of force, and that does not magically exclude the American Republic, for Christ's sakes. So where is this government where we have its citizens giving actual voluntary consent? A government runs on the initiation force or the threat thereof. Okay, tacit consent to live under the rules established by the government under whose jurisdiction you live is similar. Madison is right. The only way to determine whether a specific individual consents to live by the rules established by his government is to ask him. No, it's not. All you have to do is look at what the government is doing, for Christ's sakes. That's the empirical evidence that you need. What are they doing? Have they set up a monopoly over certain provision of services such as conflict resolution? Have they enforced and maintained that monopoly by the use of initiatory force? That also includes the Lockean, Randian government as well, this republic. There is no consent. Consent is a fucking myth. You don't have to go around asking each and every citizen. And you can't assume consent. And how about for those people who don't believe in government? Well, tough shit for them. You have nothing to say about that, Mr. Jolly Libertarian? Just because you can say that consent is given allegedly, by most people, you can coat it with most people. Well, most people feel that way. What's wrong with you, Mr. Tiny Minority? Selfish minority? The libertarian anarchists cannot assume that each and every citizen does not consent. There's an old saying, if you assume something, you make an ass out of you and me. Oh, fucking trite is that. The anarchist assumption that no one consents to live under the rule of their government is, on the face of it, asinine. Really? No. Some don't, sure, but the vast majority do. Because that's how you determine what's right. How many people agree with it? Didn't do too well for Socrates, who sucked back a hemlock cocktail, right? And this is somebody who studied general philosophy and libertarianism and Ayn Rand for the last 50 years. Fuck. Okay, tacit consent, yeah. The flaw lies in the assumption that because there is no explicit consent, there is no consent at all. It presumes to make a case for each and every citizen in the jurisdiction. But the fact is, well, some libertarian anarchists may not give consent, tacit or otherwise. A great many, indeed, the majority of citizens do give their consent. Oh, it's a majority. There's so much here. So who are you? And that's how you determine what's right and wrong, how many noses you can count. The only way to determine whether a specific individual consents to live by the rules established by his government is to ask him. The libertarian anarchist cannot assume, blah, 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 blah. Okay, I just read that. Which brings me to the next area where my views have changed considerably. As if the proceeding was like some kind of roundhouse unassailable punch to the libertarian movement. Right? But let's move on, he says, because I just took care of that. I proved consent under government. Under what government? Under what kind of government? All governments? All of them? All the different types of governments? There's consent there? Because a majority of people have given consent for this government. And what's that evidenced by? That they dutifully pay their taxes? That's the evidence? Just like the woman being raped at knife point gave her consent. But now it's not rape, though, you see. Now it's not rape because she's not objecting. She's dutifully compliant to the rapist. He doesn't have to tear her clothes off. She's doing it. She's taking her own clothes off, right? Because there's a knife there. But it's consent. You know, I might pick this article up a little bit later because right now it's just so fucking ludicrous. I can't even continue it. So I'll pick it up, but you could read it yourself. You could read it yourself. I think I've probably trenched in enough of it, and I don't want to go on and on with this. But anyway, Victor Pross signing out, anarchist artist.